I want you to write down a question, the answer to which you are extremely interested in having. And since they will be anonymous, there won't be any psychoanalytic follow-up on the type of question that you put down. So, although that would be perfectly possible. And if I see a question which signals impending neurotic breakdown, well, I'll announce that and you can see me afterwards. No, I'm being facetious. No, just write down, think of something that you have a passionate interest in having the answer to. And if you don't have any unanswered question in your life, then we are in deep trouble in this class. Now, I'm looking at all these blank faces. Now, I hope it's because you have so many you don't know which one to start with, and not because you don't have any. So just write down the question. It should start with a WH. You know? What, why, when, where. Here's one. How will the next generation be able to cope with the world around them? What are some specific influences on teaching behavior which or should result from an understanding of the Anisa philosophy? How can people be helped to develop more respect for others' rights and property? Is there an order to the universe which has an external correlate, a divine plan? Does the universe tend towards negative entropy? Is man basically good or evil? Why does man continue to pollute his environment when he knows it'll lead to his own destruction? What blocks a person from performing tasks that is expected by peers to be performed? When a child comes to school with an incorrect method of printing but is succeeding with it, why is it necessary to change him, or is it? What will I be doing in the fall? Says job, question mark. I think I recognize the handwriting. Will the Anisa philosophy carry through the child to adulthood? Where did Anisa begin? Where is the world heading, or what is to become of us? What causes the different behavioral characteristics between the dog and a cat? What is the origin of the cat? Does one really learn more thoroughly on the alpha brain level? What is the meaning of life, and where do we go from here? Why do we always strive for perfection when we know we can't attain it? Is incarnation a reality? Will the Red Sox win the pennant? What will happen in the future as far as our natural resources are concerned? What are the implications of Anisa and as his theory pertains to the middle school child? When a baby is conceived, where does the soul come from? What's life's value? How are large airplanes able to get off the ground? Why must man die? Why does the younger generation generally more aware of things and happenings today? Maybe it's why are they? What are the root causes of high crime rate in this country, and how can the people who become enmeshed in committing crimes be helped? In other words, what actions can society take to correct the situation? Why do some people stand up well emotionally to trauma and others break down? Upon what is foresight based? What is reality in contradistinction to the common sense reality we perceive? What are the characteristics of a comprehensive model of education? And will I be able to reflect in this workshop? Will I be able to reflect this workshop in my teaching next year? Now, you saw a range. Did anybody get any sense of maybe 2 or 3 or 4 basic types of questions? Anybody?
There are very few factual questions that you can answer with a straightforward fact.
All right, let us let us put over here that the question seeks an answer that is empirically verifiable. The word verity, means truth in Latin. So this means that on the basis of practical experience, you can establish the truth of the proposition, or you can establish the reality of the situation. This is a continuum now. Over to here, where they are not subject to maybe any, or we put direct verification. And these questions that we got range all the way from here clear over to here. And there are some in the middle that's hard to tell exactly where they might fall. But let's say we'll draw an arbitrary line in the middle. Now, the questions which fall on this side are philosophical questions. And the ones which fall on this side are scientific kinds of questions. Now, historically, a question that originally popped up over here through man's experience and inquiry has moved over on this side. And that in fact the advance of man and the progress of man scientifically has been largely to keep asking questions over here in new and different ways, and to set up experiments, to collect observations, until finally something is verifiable, in which case it moves over in this direction. In fact, if you look at philosophy originally was just seen as the overarching notion of science. As Mag put in her little introduction, science and philosophy were kind of one and the same thing. But the moment some of those philosophical questions came to be answered empirically with verification, and a body of questions addressing similar kinds of issues began to be answered, a science grew up with a specific name: chemistry, biology, zoology, and in finer areas, so you get histology and anatomy and physiology and so on. Now, if you take, see, at the moment, the question, will the Red Sox win the pennant? At the moment, this is over here, but in a very short space of time, it's going to move over here. So that when it's just a matter of time, then that sort of a question is not really a philosophical question. It's an empirically verifiable one. It's just a matter of waiting to see. And so I would say that one goes right, that question goes right at the far end. Now, when you take another question here to give you another one, how are large airplanes able to get off the ground? That goes right there too. Those would be two kinds of questions which are definitely on that end. Now let me take, is there an order to the universe which has an external correlate? That one goes over here. Is man basically good or evil? Or that goes over here somewhere. Where in the world are we heading, or what's to become of us? Which is a question, what is man's destiny? See, that's way over here. What is the meaning of life? Where do we go from here? What is the nature of man? Those are all over here. Now, the interesting thing is that the questions posed here create a kind of thinking which leads to remarkable discoveries. That's why philosophy is called the mother of all science. Now, in Anisa, we expect this educational system to function conceptually, the model, as the bedrock on which education can emerge as a definitive science, so that we can be held accountable as professionals, and so that the preparation of teachers can rest on a scientific foundation where you not only know what it is you have to do, but you can be taught how to do it and get predictable results. Therefore, if philosophy is the mother of science, and if we want education to emerge as a science, then it must have a philosophical basis which helps us ask all of the questions that will stimulate the thinking, that will enable us to go after all of the answers, which when we begin to accumulate them will function as an empirical foundation for a science. See, at the moment, education is seen more in traditional terms. We simply do what was done in the generation before, more or less. But we don't ask necessarily, why do we do it? Or if we are sure something isn't working, we don't get necessarily terribly outraged about it. See, but if you were a physician and you performed surgery in accordance with a given theory, and you lost the last 250 patients, somebody would be upset about it, and the theory would be challenged, and you would be compelled to change it. And if any medical school went on teaching its medical students a practice based on that theory, the medical school would suddenly be out of business. Now, medicine, only recently, in the last couple of hundred years, has come out of a kind of has come out of a situation that is a little bit like education is in now. It wasn't too long ago that people were wearing little sulfur bags around their neck, hoping that it'd make smallpox go away, and were doing all kinds of extraordinary things. See, letting blood, and well, I think there are enough of you here who remember probably some of the things that your mothers did to you, or you remember your mother talking about things that your grandmother did to your mother of that nature. And but now we ask the question, and we expect doctors not to make mistakes. At least they should not make mistakes that derive from erroneous theory. They expect, by and large, that the knowledge base for the practice to be empirically verifiable. And if they violate this, then you have a malpractice suit against you. Now, without an empirically verifiable basis, there would be no possibility, even any thought in our society, of a malpractice suit. Did you ever hear of anybody bringing a malpractice suit against a Navajo shaman? That's the medicine man. No. Because the basis for his practice is largely psychological, and he deals an awful lot in psychosomatic disorders. And they work sometimes and they don't work sometimes, because there's no distinction there between a psychosomatic illness and an organic impairment. A psychosomatic illness is a non-organic functional or dysfunction, functional impairment. I've known a lot of people, for instance, who are psychosomatically blind. They can't see, but their eyes are okay. And they can't see for a psychological reason, and once that reason is removed, they see again. 85% of the people who suffer from asthma have psychosomatic asthma. There is nothing in the air that is causing the bronchial tubes to swell up. There is a modality of thought which causes the lungs to fill up. And once that's changed, then the lungs don't fill up. So, and of course, psychosomatic medicine has an empirically verifiable basis, but it is not as clear as sort of regular medicine is. All right. An educational system is dealing with such non-empirically verifiable issues like the nature of man, and what is the meaning of life, and where are we going, and what's our ultimate destiny. And we came to the conclusion when we started out on this safari to create a new educational system, that if the educational system did not address the ultimate questions posed by man in some way, shape, or form, it would not emerge as an educational system that would be viable in the year 2000 and beyond. And therefore, we have tried to meet head-on every one of these kinds of issues and to take a stand on it. The stand may be wrong, but if it is, then ultimately it will become known. Now, you will see that in order to get from here over to here, you have to go through several steps. So from that philosophy, we have developed a body of theory. And as you'll see this afternoon when we talk about theory, we find a way of linking the statements in theory to observables. Things that you can actually interact with and see and hear and taste or whatever. And this is the way in which your philosophy actually influences what you are able to do by being, in a sense, transformed down each time. The thing that intervenes here is the model itself, which is the expression of the way you want to do things on the basis of those propositions which are set forth in theory. We have a chance to get a clear sense of what some of those are, and we'll take them right down to the grassroots level, the teacher in a particular classroom, namely you in Suffield with your kids, to see exactly how this modality of thought begins to influence how you use your energy with those children in a way that will make them better learners, which is really the ultimate objective of the Anisa-Model, an objective which is derived from certain propositions in the philosophical base of the model. Well, let me give you an example of what I mean by an empirically verifiable statement by answering how are large airplanes able to get off the ground. And I know when you're in one, like the 747, it's like a Hilton hotel taking off. And there's this incredible strain to this thing to get off the ground, and it takes off so easily. It really is something of a miracle. Now, I think it was Francis Bacon again who made a very telling statement, which was, if you want to manipulate universal law, natural law, you can only do it by obeying it. So, getting a big airplane off the ground is simply a matter of finding out what laws have to be obeyed in what way in order to get it off. And there are two basic laws which are in operation. And we won't go into it in great detail, but just to show you that we do know the answer, and therefore we didn't used to, but the question was posed, and finally it's over here. One is the law that if a force is exerted in that direction, an equal force will be exerted in that direction. So that in the case of the jet engine, when the air is pulled in because of the turning fans, and it is compressed, and then it is made hot so that when things get hot, they want to be less dense, so there's pressure built up, and it shoots out the other end. So if force is going in that direction, it then pushes the plane in that direction. So that gets it moving. Now, a movement is essential to lifting it. The shape of the wing is like this, more or less. Now, when a body of air hits here, part of it has to go this way, and part of it goes this way. Now, you can see that since the distance around here is longer than here, the air particles here have to spread out, whereas these are closer together. This then creates a partial vacuum. So the air here pushes up. And you're putting tremendous amount of air over this wing per unit time because it's moving forward. The faster it moves, the greater this semi-vacuum is above the wing, which means the greater the pressure pushing it up. So as you get up speed, it pushes it up, and finally, no matter how big it is, if you can get it fast enough, and of course the bigger it is, the faster it has to go to get up, it'll take off. Now, of course, it's a little bit more involved than that. If you've ever seen the inside of a jet plane and you see all the instrumentation, there's a lot of things that influence it, but those are the two basic laws which are in operation there, and once we know them, we can design practically anything in order to get it to move in the air. The history of aviation is a history that begins here with a desire to, why can't we fly like the bird? That's the question. To, we are flying better than the birds. Because, and of course if you look at the bird's wing, you see it has many of these same principles. Now of course the bird doesn't have jet power. It has another, it uses another kind of power. It uses the wing itself to get the forward motion, and then uses the wing itself to create this aerodynamic, to take advantage of that aerodynamic law. The advance of modern technology has proceeded precisely on this basis of discovering the law and finding a way of applying it. And this is what a lot of basic research is all about. The Anisa position on basic research is that it should be invested in fairly heavily. And yet, basic research is designed to satisfy man's curiosity, and initially, very often has no utility. But we always find a way to make use of the information later on. I remember when Michael Faraday had invented a little electrical device to measure a certain attribute of the flow of electrons. And you know the farad, which is a unit of measurement of some aspect of electrical phenomena, was named after him. And when he invented this device, he couldn't get a patent on it because he couldn't establish its utility. The British Parliament would not grant him a patent. So he decided he should not think in scientific terms, but in political terms. So when he appeared before the Parliament for the second time to get his patent, they said, "Tell us why you should have a patent on this device." And he said, "Because it's taxable, my lord." And he got the patent. So because the parliamentarians could see a use in it then, it would produce revenue at some point in time. And of course now we use that invention all the time. On the other hand, it does seem not quite right to invest heavily in basic research just to satisfy men's curiosity when there are a lot of critical human needs around not answered, whereas if we put our minds to those, we could find some answers which would have immediate practical utility. Well, you get an idea now that the basic distinction between philosophical thought and scientific thought has to do with empirical verifiability. What does empirical mean? Anybody? It means subject to practice, subject to doing and observing. I want to just quote a statement from a great philosopher, Ewing, who says, "We refuse to regard as philosophical those questions, the answers to which can be given empirically." And that seems to be the basic distinction. Then as empirically verifiable knowledge accumulates around a philosophical issue, it usually breaks away from philosophy and becomes a science. And this is what happened to psychology, which was always a part of philosophy until a long time ago, and then it finally broke off, but it still has a lot of apron strings that it's tied to in philosophy because it made the mistake of borrowing from physics everything that physics was doing and tried to import it lock, stock, and barrel and therefore come to understand man in the same terms that Newton and his amazing crew were understanding the nature of the universe, which was a mechanistic approach. We'll get into that in a minute. Now, a couple of quotes from Whitehead, whose cosmology we have drawn most heavily on in developing the Anisa-Model. I meant to bring a book for you. It's a book that gives the summaries of 200 major philosophers, and which I recently acquired and use as a handy reference now, because those enormous volumes of the original writings of all these philosophers is an enormous compendium of information which is very difficult to go through, and this summary seemed to be very nice. But we, in trying to make certain that the roots of this model were based or were sunk deeply into the best of man's thinking throughout civilized time, we made it our business to sample that thinking. 2,300 years of it, starting before Parmenides, starting with Parmenides, who is the only significant philosopher, Greek philosopher before Socrates, who began to raise many of these basic issues and then provide non-empirically verifiable answers to them. But once you generate theories from those answers, then pretty soon you get down to a practice, you see, and that's what the big struggle is all about. Whitehead says, philosophy brings insight and foresight and a sense of the worth of life. In short, that sense of importance which nerves all civilized effort. Another place he says, philosophy is an attempt to clarify those fundamental beliefs which finally determine the emphasis of attention that lies at the basis of character. In other words, if you go through life without ever asking yourself these critical questions, what do you spend your time on and your thought on and your money on will be in accordance with those questions. Now, of course, we have to be concerned with practical, mundane things like, where will I be next year? Will I have a job? Or, if you have a little interest, will the Red Sox win the pennant? And so on. But if our level of thought is always down there, then life will come and go, and you will not have participated in that force that nerves civilization forward. In fact, you will sort of be on the drag end of things, rather than on the cutting edge of what Whitehead calls nudging the race forward, reluctantly and painfully, being on the cutting edge. Now, it is our thesis that the educational system should itself provide children with the kinds of stimulus that make them ask the critical questions so that they are on the cutting edge. The educational system should not be simply a place where information about the status quo is disseminated and where we expect the students to receive that information passively and not critique it or challenge it, but just go on. Because that kind of an educational system is creating an obsolete model of man. It just isn't going to survive the year 2000 the way we're going now. And I think we'll be able to demonstrate that case very convincingly as we move forward. Now, Mag has given you a number of quotes in the Whitehead thing, and I'm going to be referring to those a little bit after the coffee break, because after the coffee break, I want to begin examining some fundamental propositions which outline the philosophical basis of the Anisa-Model. Incidentally, some of you may have read that little pamphlet on philosophy, and if you don't have it, we can certainly bring some. I don't know, Mag, do you have sets of them that you can make available? This is called The Philosophy of the Anisa-Model, written by Ray Shepard and myself. And I just wanted you to know that that little 20-page article is a condensation of this. And this is a condensation of all of those philosophers, starting with Parmenides. And it is a review of those basic perspectives by the great thinkers of all time. So that Anisa is creative in the sense that it relied on and synthesized the best thinking of the greatest minds of all time. And that's why we feel bold enough to appear immodest and say that we have the conceptual foundations for a new educational system for the year 2000 and beyond. And when the going gets tough and the big guns are turned against us to shoot us down, which is always what happens when anybody comes up with a new system, this system will not collapse very easily because it is resting on such firm foundations. The Anisa tree will not blow over because its roots are very deep. So that anybody who takes us on has to take on all the philosophers of history, and they have to take on Whitehead. Now, of course, Whitehead makes a very important point, namely, you have to be willing to be humble before the facts and to change your mind when evidence to the contrary of your position is presented. And we've tried to build that into the Anisa-Model. We've been changing for the last 13 years. We're changing now. We'll never be the same. That's why we can never tell you what the last word is in Anisa, because every time we get a new insight or somebody else comes up with something or somebody challenges us and they seem to be right and we're wrong, then we have to change our thinking. And this is the way the model has grown. This book is Whitehead's book, Process and Reality, and by some strange chance it was given to me by kind of a kooky friend. He just says, "For Dan, may you read and enjoy this." And he told me he got to page 8 and gave up. No, yes, page 8. He wrote a little note there, and that was the end of it. And he gave the book to me, and I started reading it. And as you can see now, it's well underlined and noted. I have extracted from it statements, insights, definitions, hints, propositions, and so on, and put them on 3x5 cards and have a drawer this big, because I'm preparing to give an advanced seminar in Whitehead in a couple of years. I keep saying in a couple of years, so I should have given it 5 years ago, but I keep putting it off 2 years. It's amazing stuff, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you read it, but because it is incredibly difficult. And that's because it is so abstract, and it is abstract because it is trying to address, to find the ultimate principles underlying the nature of the universe and where man fits into it. Now, when we first started putting together this educational system, I really had no intention of taking all that on. I thought, get a nice little school and get these little kiddies in there and teach them how to read in a better way, and that'd be it. But I found out that this issue of the nature of man had to be addressed fully. Otherwise, we had no hope of being different from 22 other educational models in the country. We have now examined those 22 other models, and there must be more than that around, but they're just not called models. In fact, we don't think they are. Those 22 are models, because they're not characterized by specifications, which would enable you to recognize the model if you saw it. And I don't think any one of those models has anywhere near the clear conceptual foundation and the clear, coherent body of theory that Anisa represents. The greatest living organismic philosopher is Charles Hartshorne. He's at the University of Texas. He was a pupil of Whitehead's. And he has said in a publication not too long ago that it will take 10,000 years for man to exhaust the insights of this cosmology. And that, he says, is 10,000 years with large numbers of people working on it. Well, we don't have that many people working on it, but we have a few. And then Patabi gave me, for my birthday a few days ago, a book called The Hartshorn Festschrift. It's a festival of writing in memory of, or to Charles Hartshorn, by his pupils, in which they say this represents a great addition to Whiteheadian literature. And I was interested to note in here there is a chapter on Whitehead in the non-English world, because Whitehead was an Englishman who left Cambridge and came to Harvard, went from Cambridge to Cambridge. He was a mathematician, logician, and ultimately a philosopher. And I was really very impressed at how Whitehead in the last 10 years has begun to be translated into French, into German, to all the Scandinavian languages, into Spanish, into Italian, into Russian, and that they predict in here that in the next 50 years, Whitehead, who has remained for some strange reason, relatively obscure as a philosopher, will emerge as the great philosopher in the 20th century. Well, I can see why he's remained a little bit obscure, because when you try to read it, it will just, one page and you'll be ill. And this is largely for two reasons, which Whitehead outlines. And when he outlined that, at least it made me feel comfortable about dealing with it. He said, when you try to create a new system of thought, you have to redesign language. And you can redesign language in two ways. You can use old words and endow them with new meanings, in which case everybody will be confused. Or you can invent new words, in which case you'll put everybody off. So he said there's no way to win. You either put people off or you confuse them. And I think Whitehead did both. He both put people off and confused them, because he invented some new words, but he endowed some old words with some radically new meanings, and it's curious. When you are reading this stuff, when you come to those words, you have to make yourself think of them in a new way. Now, there are going to be a few words like that, because Anisa was faced with exactly the same problem. Redesigning a language, a terminology, and endowing that terminology with some new meanings. And Jeff is doing his advanced graduate work in the area of symbolization and meaning in language. So I'm hoping by the time he gets done with his dissertation, we're going to have more of a hold, a handle, on how to help people do this, how to help people get a new meaning of a word without always regressing to the common meaning which they attach to it. We have been depressed by our own repeated experience with ourselves and with others that people think they know what a word is because they can use it in a sentence and because they can pronounce it. And therefore we have paid particular attention to the definition of a definition, so that when we define something, we know that it is, by golly, defined. And you will see, when we get to the theory, that much of the relationship between theory and practice inheres in a real definition, and therefore we are real bugs on definition. We have a long way to go, but I think we've made a good start. Okay. Now, I want to just jazz up your minds a little bit about the scope of philosophy, given this kind of orientation, so that you can begin to appreciate the foundation of this educational system. Once I give you that overall view of all philosophy, by breaking it down into categories of inquiry, which are all on this end, then I'm going to pick the part that Whitehead falls into and give you a few statements about Whitehead to get us going. Then we'll have a coffee break, and then we'll come back and I will begin to outline what I am calling the first principles on which the Anisa-Model rests, and outline for you why you've got to have some first principles and what the nature of a first principle is and what they are in the Anisa model. There's one branch of philosophy called speculative philosophy. And, to speculate means to, this comes from the same word as spectacles. So it means to take a look at. But the curious thing is that you can never see what it is you're looking at in this case, because this is philosophy, and therefore it's speaking about non-empirically, non-verifiable aspects of existence. There are three kinds of speculative philosophy. One is called, you don't have to take this down unless you just want to, but I just want you to get an idea of this vast sea of knowledge on which this model rests. Ontology and cosmology. Now, the word metaphysics, which tries to get at the ultimate nature of reality, that's what all this is really about. Ontology means a study of being or reality. These sort of tries to get behind whatever exists behind appearances, which is also what reality is. Aristotle wrote a book called Physics, which is about all the things that exist in the world, in the concrete material world. Then he wrote a book, a philosophical book called Metaphysics. Meta is the Greek word that simply means after. So he wrote physics, and then he wrote metaphysics, which means just a book after physics. So that word kind of stuck and came to be referred to a kind of thought that attempts to get behind physical reality or concrete experience, you see. Cosmology tries to discern or disclose the ultimate order of the entire universe as a way of getting at the nature of being a reality. And this is a cosmology, and Whitehead is a speculative philosopher. So this is where the big thrust of philosophical inquiry has been. Now, let me give you an example of the problem with reality. Most of you will agree that this is real. But the only way you can relate to it is on the basis of its appearance. It is cream-colored. It has a texture. It has a certain sound and a certain weight, and it will burn or not burn, depending on what it's made of. But what is it? Is that all it is? Just an accumulation of attributes which you can pick up through sense perception? Or is it something else? Well, these philosophers would say it is something else. If you try to deal with this only on the basis of those attributes, you will not be really in touch with it. Now, think what this means when you're relating to a child. Do you think you are in touch with that child's reality because you can see that he's a little bit podgy, that he's frowny, that he's got blonde hair, that he's got blue eyes, and that he wears his shoes untied? Does that put you in touch with the ultimate substance and reality of that creature? Well, hardly. And yet, we have repeatedly observed parents, teachers, human beings who relate to other human beings precisely on that level. And in fact, people get married on that basis. Now, if you really want to know what this is made of, you have to become so abstract that it's, for most people, meaning is lost. But this stuff is made up of, ultimately, a tight field force of magnetism, bound energy in the form of electrons whizzing around a nucleus. And these electrons are, just negative charges. Actually, they're positive charges, but we call them negative because Benjamin Franklin made a mistake. And he called positive charges negative and vice versa, and it stuck. And the distance between the nucleus of an atom and an electron going around is like the distance between the Earth and the Sun, 93 million miles. You take the size of the Earth and its distance from the Sun, you see how much space there is between the Earth and the Sun? Now supposing you could just all collapse that right down. If you had a thimbleful of just plain electrons, there would be no piece of equipment on this Earth that could lift it. There is so much space between the middle of the atom and the electrons rolling around it, just like there's all this space between the Earth and the Sun that we're revolving around, because we got the idea of the structure of the atom from looking at the way the universe is out there. You see, we're probably as some philosophers say, we may be just a little molecule on the hind leg of some enormous flea that is on some more enormous dog in somebody else. It just goes on and on. It's mind-boggling. Well, you see, these philosophers say, if you look at just the appearances here, you're not going to be in touch with this. Now, if you agree with me on that basis, then you will have put yourself into a position where you will recognize then the absolute necessity of theory. Because a theory is designed to put you in touch with things beyond their appearances. And this doesn't mean to say that appearance is not important, because as I put down here, we got to get to observables at some point. Another branch of philosophy is called critical philosophies, or analytical philosophy. And it's the philosophy that tries to understand and criticize the very way in which philosophy goes about trying to discover the nature of reality. And it has branches: epistemology, logic, and semantics. Different people break these philosophies down in different ways, but I find this the most, MAG has a slightly different organization there, but you can break it down in different ways. But this is one way to look at the different branches of philosophy. I'm going to talk about two basic principles of logic shortly, which when you understand then provides the basis for all systematic thought. And without it, you'd be kind of a dummy. That's why ultimately when we get all of the cognitive part of the Anisa-Model together, there will be introduced for children very early on a course in logic, so that by the time they are in high school, they are wonderful logicians. They are critical of the process of thinking itself, and therefore are sensitive to all kinds of non sequiturs. And therefore, they would be rather trying to have in class, unless you're absolutely on your toes. See, this is the problem you always run, of creating a child that's smarter than yourself, quicker than you are. And since you have 30 to look after, and he's just got to look after himself. I feel a little bit that way being a professor. I envy all my students who can read all the time. See, they now can read things that I can't read. And that's why the Anisa-Model has to operate on a team basis, because there is no way for one person to know it all. Just impossible. And so what you have to do is have to keep a good relationship with everybody, so they'll keep passing it on to you what they know, and you reciprocate by passing on what you know, and that way you have an enlightened community growing up, you see. So, epistemology ask the question, what is the nature of knowledge? Now you think, well, that's an easy question to answer, but there are just tomes written on the nature of knowledge. And you can just take it from me. It's a complicated issue. For instance, one of the questions epistemology asks, how can you be sure what you know is true? Well, that raises the question of what is truth. And that then raises the question of what is reality. And as you see, we say truth is always a relationship between appearance and reality. Reality is simply what is, but we can never be absolutely in touch with that, and therefore we go on appearance. Now, there is a relationship between here, and that's the truth of anything. So the truth is pretty relative stuff, but reality is whatever is. Truth is not the same as reality. Logic has to do with the reasoning process. It spells out the rules for getting to an accurate conclusion from a given premise. And that those have all been ironed out now, and for all practical intents and purposes, we can now say that if the premise is right, applying the rules of deductive logic, the conclusion will be true, without a doubt. So that's all been pretty well worked out. Semantics has to do with the nature of meaning and how language is connected to events. There's a wonderful book, which is also mind-boggling, called, by I.A. Richard, called The Meaning of Meaning, which I tried to read about 10 years ago, and it just, I came to it too soon. I was still at the concrete operation stage of Piagetian cognitive development, and I couldn't leap up to the formal operations, and so I didn't get it. But it struggles with this notion of meaning, and it turns out that the meaning is not simply the definition of a word. I mean, what is the meaning of this occasion? See, and here was the ultimate question, of course, was, what is the meaning of life? Well, that's it also addresses the question of, is what we are saying what we mean? Now, you may think what you're saying is what you mean, but if you're sitting down with somebody and they feed it back to you, you often find out that you did not say what you meant. It is hard to say exactly what you mean and to be certain that other people have gotten it. And of course, the medium for that is language, and therefore the ability to handle language is of critical importance in the Anisa-Model, because a person who can say what he means and be sure that other people get the meaning is better off than somebody who can't. And here we are in a great conflict in American society, because we do not make excellent speech a prerequisite necessarily for certification. We would in the Anisa-Model ultimately. Do you know, in Russia, there is no correlation between your social class origins and whether or not you become a physicist, a state engineer, a medical researcher, zoologist, biologist, or astronaut. Because in the Soviet nurseries, at the very earliest ages, the children are exposed to excellent speech models. Since we come to know reality only by interacting with its appearance, then the language we use, which is the representation of that appearance inside of our head, has got to be extraordinarily accurate. Otherwise, we will not be in touch with that reality. And when we are not in touch with it very well, we will be ineffective in dealing with it. And therefore, language is of super importance. Now, what do? In daycare